Starting in 1990, I got my first job, which, as I say, was at the School of Oriental and African Studies. I was hired to replace William Skilland, who was one of the pioneers of Korean studies in Europe, in the UK, and who I had the pleasure of meeting and getting to know for a couple years while we were there. So I took over from Bill Skilland, and of course the greater part of my responsibilities were to run the language program and to teach courses on language, linguistics, and literature. Sort of a very broad series of responsibilities. So the first thing I did, I mean, even to this day, one of the most serious obstacles to making any progress in Korean studies is, of course, language training, Korean language education. As I say, in the 1980s, very few universities in North America were teaching Korean. There were extremely few textbooks available in English, and what was available I didn't particularly like. And so the first thing I did when I got to SOAS was spend a lot of time, more time than I wish I had, developing new teaching materials. And so basically wrote a new textbook. The second year I was at SOAS, we hired Young Jae-hoon to come and join the team at SOAS. And so with Young Jae-hoon, we wrote essentially an updated version of Samuel Martin's beginning Korean textbook, which was the textbook that I had kind of, imnyuked or entered, input into my head before I went to Korea for the first time, but which nobody would ever use because it was in Romanization. It was also quite outdated. Some of the language was just odd, etc. So essentially we kind of upgraded and rewrote that textbook, but keeping the same grammatical engine and the sort of same analyses that were in the textbook. And so I committed to doing that starting in 1990 already. That took several years. Eventually that came out as 2 volumes, Beginning Korean and Continuing Korean, I think, published by Tuttle. Still in print, people still buy it, although nobody really uses it as part of a teaching program at a university. And the reason for that, one of the reasons for it, is that almost simultaneously with me launching this project to update Martin's textbook, the Korea Foundation was formed in 1992, and one of its first projects was to kind of launch a big collaborative project in North America to create new textbooks for learning Korean, which pretty much everybody who was involved with Korean studies or Korean language education in the United States got involved with. And they asked me to be part of that team when I was still at SOAS, and I said no for various reasons, but one was just practical. It was really not practical for me, being located in England, to be part of a big project happening in the United States. There are other reasons too. I just didn't think that they would come up with anything that I would like, and I just prefer to be independent. So anyway, a big part of my life, my professional life, all these years, right until the present day, has been the preparation of teaching materials, and teaching materials that I like, meaning that for me to like them, I basically have to create them myself. So I've rarely ever used teaching materials in my own teaching that are by other people, just because I don't like them. They do things that don't suit me. And so I, at least if I write my own materials, however imperfect they might be, I can change them and I can correct them. But if I'm using someone else's materials and I don't like them, I can't change them. So I have, to this day, continued to work on different kinds of materials because we have so little that is available in English, and it's still a problem. The field of Korean language education is still very weak and underdeveloped in many ways, although of course it has grown and improved since the 1990s. So while I'm still at SOAS, I'm spending most of my time on teaching materials, but also on Koryo saram and Koryo mae related materials. So between 1990 and 2005, which was the last trip I made to the former Soviet Union, I probably went, I think I went back and forth to somewhere in the former Soviet Union about 13 times, interviewing people, collecting data, etc. Probably the last time I actually interviewed a Koryo saram halmani was in 2002 or 2003. I can't really remember. One of the things I noticed very early on, already in the early 1990s, was that once South Korea was able to conclude formal diplomatic relations with Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan and the countries of the former Soviet Union, Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan, all in Russia, were basically flooded with South Korean businessmen, but also South Korean missionaries. And what I noticed in Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan was how quickly the speech patterns of Koryo saram were essentially infected, or anyway affected, but infected in my view, by South Korean standard. And it really kind of changed the environment for doing linguistic field work. It really changed the social linguistic dynamics, and in my view kind of ruined it, made it much less interesting after the mid-1990s. On top of which, many of the older speakers were continuing to die. Many of the old ladies and old men that I spoke to, wonderful, interesting people who had really never been asked to tell these stories until I came along, because it was kind of taboo. They were, dying off one by one. And so, in my view, after about 2005, I sort of said to myself, well, this is, it's really the time to do field work and collect, data from, interviews is really over. And that, of course, since then, South Korean scholars have also gone over and tried to do the research, and in my view their work is severely compromised, first of all by their lack of knowledge of Russian. Typically South Korean scholars in Korean linguistics don't know any foreign languages at all, let alone Russian. They don't even read English, and so they're, I think, severely hampered in their ability to do work, plus the fact, as I said, the language has changed so much through contact with South Koreans of various types. So about 2004, 2005, I kind of said, you know what, it's time to stop this field work. I'm not going to get anything interesting or new. It's very expensive to do it, especially if you're in, Vancouver, Canada. I moved to Canada in 1995, and just a single trip, to Kazakhstan would cost thousands of dollars. Research funds are not easy to come by. It's just got more and more difficult to do. So around 2005, I sort of said, okay, time to really stop all this field work and do something else, or start writing it up, or and I had a plan to do a dictionary with Nellie Pak, which is now on a back burner for various reasons. But then sort of 2007, 2008, I applied for some research funding. How did it work? I'm trying to remember the exact chronology. But so 2008, I became head of department, and I knew that I would have to, and this was at the time still a pretty good sized department, with Korean, Japanese, Chinese, and South Asia, India, and probably 50 colleagues at the time. So a lot of work, and I knew that at some point I would have to serve in that role, but I didn't realize that I would have to do so quite so soon, or for quite so long. So I was head of department until 2020. So in effect for 12 years. And that also really constrained my ability to do certain kinds of research or to do field work. And just before I became head of department, well, no, this I guess shortly after I became, I got very interested. I mean, my training is so I very interested in the dialects and in Koreamal as an important under-researched diasporic dialect of Korean. Koreamal is just really interesting. And I got interested in it partly because I knew Russian, partly because of my trip to Tashkent, in 1986, but also because I had been trained in Korean historical linguistics, and to really appreciate Koreamal and what it has to offer us in terms of etymology, history of the Korean language, how it relates to other forms of Korean, you need to know Korean historical linguistics, and that was my training. But so as part of my training in Korean historical linguistics, of course, I spent lots of time learning classical Chinese, or what they call Hanmun in Korea, and acquainting myself with old texts, and so had this real interest in pre-modern, pre-20th century Korean textuality and reading practices and how Koreans dealt with texts. And because of that particular, and in a comparative way, because Japanese has many similar sort of reading technologies that the Koreans had, in fact learned them from the Koreans. So that particular topic was of interest to me, and more or less, almost as a joke, I applied in 2010, I think, for money from the Academy of Korean Studies. They had this new category of funding called the Korean Studies Laboratory, and for which they had completely megalomaniacal kind of goals, very unrealistic goals and expectations. They were thinking that, Nobel laureates were going to apply for this funding and bring glory to the Korean government, by doing research on Korean. And the sums of money that they were offering were actually not that impressive. The Koreans at the time thought it was a lot of money, but it wasn't enough really to attract the kinds of people that they wanted to attract. Anyway, I applied for that, for a comparative project on Korean and Japanese reading and glossing practices in ancient texts, assuming that I would not get it. And sure enough, the first time I applied, and I had a team of 5 other colleagues that were on the grant. I didn't get it, and in fact, what was interesting was that the evaluation that came back, to say why it was that I didn't get it, I don't know who it was. It's all anonymous, but said, "Oh, under no circumstances should we give a grant like this to a foreigner because it'll make Korea look Sinocentric." There was this real paranoia about any research that might make Korea like it was somehow dependent upon or focused on or learning from China, which of course is absurd because of course it was Sinocentric. But that's not the point. The point is, how did the Koreans do things differently with the same text the Chinese were reading? And so anyway, the next year, because I was so busy as head of department, I said, what the hell, I'm going to submit exactly the same application, change not a word, not a footnote, not a period, and just see what happens. And sure, and then I got it, which was actually a kind of a disaster because I got this big grant, and for humanities in North America, it was pretty good money. It was something like $1.3 million over 5 years. Of course, split amongst 5 people, and most of the money went to students and so on. But it was a big chunk of money, a lot of time and headaches to manage while I'm also being head of department, of a department that kept growing and growing. So that was 2011. The grant was for 5 years, but then you get another 3 years to kind of finish writing everything up. And so that grant basically ate up all of my time until 2020, when I stepped down as head. And even now I'm still finishing projects that were started with that funding, even though the funding is long gone. And so that particular grant and that particular topic, these pre-modern textual things, have really taken me away from Koryo Saram and Koryo Mal studies all this time. And now that I'm no longer head of department, and now that we're finally finishing some of the volumes that we promised to do with that money from the Academy of Korean Studies, I'm slowly now trying to circle back to getting back to some of the materials that I have from the Soviet Union about Koryoman. That's kind of the next project. But then to come back to the problem of Korean language teaching. So while I was head of department from 2008 to 2020, for those 12 years, I was not teaching undergraduate courses. My teaching was only graduate seminars. And what was actually really great about being head of department and being able to teach only graduate courses, I only had to teach one course because the admin is so much work. I was actually able to focus my teaching on training some really good graduate students, which I don't think I could have done if I was teaching language classes and just teaching full-time, undergraduate courses. So during those 12 years, I managed to produce 6 PhDs, of whom I'm quite proud. The last one finished last year. And so the first one was Daphne Zur, who is now professor of Korean literature at Stanford University. She was my first PhD. Second PhD, Shine Park, is now associate professor at Harvard, has been at Harvard now for 8 or 9 years, teaching pre-modern literature. Daphne works on modern Korean literature. And then who's next? I guess the next was Eun-Sun Kim, wrote a really interesting dissertation on the history of ideas about linguistic politeness, from the end of the 19th century into the colonial period, up to the present, really. And she's now teaching at Australia National University. Jung-hae Son Jung-hae, she did a really interesting dissertation. She did field work, sort of ethnographic field work in 2 different Zainichi, Korean ethnic schools in Osaka. One was a kind of more international school that had students from both the kind of pro-North and pro-South factions, and one school was one of these North Korean schools, and did a really interesting comparison about language ideologies, Korean language ideologies in education in these schools in Japan, in Osaka. She's now teaching a full-time language instructor at UBC. And then Danny Pieper finished a couple years ago, wrote about language education during the colonial period and sort of Japanese colonial language policies. He's now teaching at Monash University in Australia. And then the last PhD was Scott Wells, who wrote a wonderful dissertation about the rise of the modern Hanmun Hua. He calls it Hanmun Hua. How did Hanmun, as a classical Chinese, how did it get demoted as kind of the universal language to just another subject in Korean schools, and how did the modern curriculum for teaching Hanmun develop in the colonial period? And he is now teaching high school, still doing research, might eventually find a way into academia, but has not so far landed an academic job. So those are my 6 PhDs, and you'll notice that none of them are actually PhDs in language pedagogy. They're not in applied linguistics. I refuse to train students. I do not take PhD students, never did, in Korean language teaching, because I think it's unfortunate that there are so few professorial positions in Korean linguistics and Korean language teaching in North America. Here in Korea, our colleagues seem to think that everything is just fine, that Korean studies is thriving, that Korean language education is a roaring success in North America. I do not think that is true. I think it's actually in crisis in many ways. And anyway, I didn't want to train PhDs for shitty jobs as language teachers that don't have tenure, that don't have pensions. Most of the jobs that are out there teaching Korean are really not good jobs in North America. They're very unstable. They're not well paid. Lots of, they're overworked, underpaid. Really just not good jobs. And so I have very consciously chosen not to train students in that field, and so my students have been trained in literature or history. But but with a very heavy language-related kind of angle. So social and cultural history of language and writing, or else straight-up literature like Daphne or Shine. So now that I'm no longer head of department, and I'm now back teaching undergraduate courses again, I've returned to a pet project of mine, which I started in about 2005 and worked on for a few years before I became head of department, and that is Hanja education. I think that the almost complete lack of any teaching, any courses, any textbooks to help learners of Korean learn Hanja. And I don't mean teaching them to write Chinese poetry. I don't mean teaching them how to write lots of characters from memory. Just a basic acquaintance with Hanja and with the vocabulary that they create, which is 70% of the dictionary. That this is a huge disgrace. It's kind of the big dirty secret of Korean language education is that even here in Korea, all of the different language training institutes, the Ohakdang, they rarely, if ever, offer courses in Hanja to foreign students. Obviously, they don't need to offer those courses to students from Japan and China. And I have this attitude that foreign students don't need it, and I think that's wrong. I think they do. They don't have to spend a ton of time on it, but a couple semesters. And our Korean peers here in Korea, when they graduate from high school, have some sort of acquaintance with between 1,500 and 1,800 Chinese characters. They learn them and they forget them, and if that's the case, so should we, as when we learn Korean. And they learn them here, even in North Korea. North Korean students graduate from high school with a knowledge of at least 1,100 Chinese characters. Same thing, they learn them in school and then they forget them, and yet it is part of their training. And I think it should be for us too. And the reason there are lots of really good linguistic and pedagogical reasons that we need to teach our students Hanja. So I've revived a course, I've created a new website, I've revised a textbook that's already been published for sort of essentially teaching the first 400 or 500 Hanja and lots of related vocab. I'm still working on that now. I started teaching it again last year. So that's something I'm still it's a crusade of mine. I think it's really a disgrace, and the reason it's particularly disgraceful, and the reason that I think it's actually harming Korean studies, is that if you look, at least in North America, and again I can only really speak for North America because that's what I know best. If you look at, I don't have the hard data, but if you were to do a survey of all of the PhD students in Korean studies in North America, as well as all of the professors in positions that are dedicated to teaching Korean studies, you would find that probably something like 80% or more of them are actually ethnically Korean, either 1.5 generation Korean, or are born, raised, and educated in Korea before they went abroad to study in North America. And the thing about that is, if you look at Japanese studies and Chinese studies, that is not the case. It is not the case that in Japanese studies and Chinese studies, something like 80% of everybody at the highest levels are in fact Japanese and Chinese. Why is that? Well, because the infrastructure for Japanese language training and the infrastructure for Chinese language training is so much better than it is for Korean. The infrastructure for learning, teaching Korean is just super weak. There's a lack of fellowships and scholarships and bursaries, of opportunities for long-term in-country study. There's less textbooks, and we don't teach Hanja. And so what that means is that even though you might major in Korean at a North American university and take 4 years of Korean while you're in university in North America, and maybe even spend 1 year as an exchange student in Korea, even coming out of level 6 at something like Yonsei or Kode, you still do not have enough Korean to do research in Korean at the highest level. And that is a problem. And so to solve that problem, first of all, we need to start teaching Hanja again. But so another project of mine, just focusing again on language pedagogy, let's rewind a little bit. Back in 1999, I actually returned to the language villages because I was invited by the language villages in Minnesota, by Concordia Language Villages, to launch a new Korean language village. And at the time, it was probably, I thought to myself, normally it would be academic suicide to get involved with a project like that. But when I went to UBC, I actually was hired with tenure, which is a really, big deal. So I didn't have to worry about, oh, am I going to, is this going to take away all my time and I won't have time for research and I won't get tenure. And so I had tenure, so I was pretty secure in that sense. So, and I thought this was really important because there are absolutely zero opportunities in North America for any learners under the age of 18 who are not ethnically Korean to learn Korean. There's nowhere to go. No schools teach Korean. It's virtually unheard of to be able to learn Korean in a public school or even in a private school in North America. And so I thought, okay, look, this is great. This is an opportunity to create a space where students, young people who want to learn Korean can go and start doing it. And so in 1999, we launched the Korean language village. It's called Supsoge Hosu, the lake in the woods, just like Yesnoya Ozira, the Russian language village, and Vartse, they all mean the lake in the woods. And that's still going strong. I stepped down in, I think, 2013 because I was just too busy being head of department and doing the language village. But now Daphne Zur is in charge, and the program is going great. We're building a new year-round site. We have a wonderful donor who thus far has given us $7 million to build a new site. And I see it as the beginning of a pipeline to produce high-level, high-achieving learners of Korean. And so our students at Supsoge Hosu, we have a 4-week program where in 4 weeks you can get high school credit, essentially attesting to the fact that you have learned the minimum equivalent of 180 hours of high school instruction. And we have many students who come to us for 3 or 4 summers like that doing the 4-week program. And the problem now that we have is that these students, and these are not ethnically Korean students, they're not Korean speakers, they're non-heritage learners. They then say, okay, great, I love the Korean language and culture so much, I am going to make my choice of university based on the fact whether or not I can take additional courses in Korean studies and Korean language at college. And so we were able to demonstrate to the Korea Foundation, who normally never support anything below university level, we were able to demonstrate that the vast majority of our villagers at the Korean language village base their choice of university on the availability of Korean studies and Korean language courses. So, okay, they support us now, great, they give us a little bit of money. But the problem we found was that our students, especially the ones that did the intensive 4-week high school credit program for more than 1 summer, would show up the first day of university, take the placement tests for the Korean language program, and place into 4th year Korean. But they don't teach 4th year Korean, because very few universities teach 4th year. Sometimes they don't even teach 3rd year Korean. And so our students from Supsoge Hosu are already running out of road once they get to university, depending on which university they go to. And this is a problem. So this is, again, I think, gets to this issue of how Korean language education in North America, and if that's true in North America, it's true everywhere else, the infrastructure is very weak. And there is no investment. The Koreans themselves are not making any significant investments in improving that infrastructure. So that's if you're thinking of a Korean language education pipeline, the Supsoge Hosu, the Korean language village, is the entrance, the beginning of the pipeline. So the other problem is at the very end. So even if you do 4 years of university, even if you do an MA program, frankly, your Korean, if you're not a Korean already, your Korean is not good enough to read research articles in Korean that have hanja in them and that are, basically academic Korean. So what we need is something like they have in Yokohama for Japanese called the Inter-University Center, where the best, the highest level academic PhD programs that teach students and produce PhDs in Japanese studies, they go there to learn academic Japanese. So we need that for Korean, and we started that. I helped launch that with John Duncan from UCLA about 5 years ago, 6 years